It's December 7th, 1941. A quiet morning for the navies at Pearl Harbor has been shattered by an attack that was never expected. A Japanese sneak attack fleet consisting of 2 battleships and hundreds of aircraft eluded radar detection, traveled across the Pacific Ocean, and reached the island of Oahu in Hawaii. Their target? The most important U.S. naval base and home of the Pacific Fleet, Pearl Harbor. In addition to bringing the neutral U.S. into World War II, the Pearl Harbor attack stirred up a strong anti-Japanese sentiment within the state and entirely changed the Japanese Americans' lives, marking a turning point in U.S. history, especially in terms of racial discrimination. Let's go back to the beginning and dig deeper into the story. In 1940, the world was in chaos, except for the United States. Countries like Germany, France, and England were busy dealing with the European theater of World War II. In Asia, the small island nation of Japan was engaged in the unlimited slaughter and exploitation of resources in its neighboring country of China. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, the U.S. maintained its traditional neutrality on World War until Japan further expanded its invasion. Ambitious Japanese leaders signed a neutrality treaty with the Soviet Union, making it clear that Japanese troops would enter Southeast Asia, where U.S. interests were greater. As a result of Japan's brutal invasion of China, who is America's partner at the time, and more importantly, Japan's potential threat to U.S. territory, President Franklin Roosevelt imposed a series of economic and diplomatic sanctions on Japan. Japan, already strapped for resources, made an extreme decision under the increasing pressure. Knowing that their military power was inferior to that of the United States, Japan decided to first secretly raid the U.S. naval base, which caused the famous Pearl Harbor attack. Maintaining strict radio silence during the 3,500-mile trek, the Japanese fleet was well hidden and undetected before their arrival. It was a complete surprise to the United States. Unscathed, U.S. losses were heavy. The U.S. suffered 3,435 casualties and lost of or severe damage to 188 planes, 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, and 4 miscellaneous vessels. But at the same time, the American response was extreme and the results for the United States were significant. Americans were outraged. The already intensifying U.S.-Japanese relations broken down completely at this moment. The U.S., which had been riddled with controversy and divided views over whether it should go to war, was united immediately after the attack.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On December 8, 1941, the day after the attack, President Franklin Roosevelt delivered the famous Day of Infamy speech, which emphasized the historic nature of the events at Pearl Harbor, rattling popular sentiment and seeking war against Japan. On the same day, Congress immediately voted on a resolution in response to President Roosevelt's request to declare war on Japan. With 0 votes against in the Senate and only 1 against in the House, Congress approved the request and formally declared war on Japan. Several days after that, Nazi Germany and its Axis partner declared war on the United States. Since then, the neutrality of the United States has been completely shattered, and the U.S. formally entered World War II, marking an essential turning point for both the U.S. and world history. This is important. It changed the future of many countries and international affairs. The entry of the U.S. was the key factor that led to the victory of the war against fascism. Germany was defeated and divided. France, Britain, and Japan were all weakened. The United States built station troops in Japan and its power began to take root in Western Europe and East Asia, greatly consolidating its position as a world's dominant power. Now, back to another major turning point as a result of the Pearl Harbor attack. Further intensified U.S.-Japanese relations and foiled a strong anti-Japanese sentiment in the United States. With strong anti-Japanese sentiment, many drawings satirized Japan and discriminated against Japanese people began to circulate. These drawings often feature stereotypical Japanese looks and behavior, glasses, short, thick beards, and devious smile. Jap, a term of endearment for Japanese, could also be used casually. But wait, here's where another problem arises. What about the Japanese Americans who were still in the United States at the time? President Roosevelt issued Executive Order of 9066 on February 19, 1942, authorizing the forced relocation of all persons deemed to be a threat to the national security from the West Coast to the resettlement centers further inland, resulting in the incarceration of Japanese Americans. Combined with the long-standing problem of racial discrimination in the state, the disaster for Japanese Americans began. At first, Japanese Americans were encouraged to evacuate voluntarily, but its response was not favorable, with only 7% of them obeying the order. So months later, under the authority of Roosevelt Executive Order, Proclamation No. 4 was issued. All Japanese Americans on the West Coast were required to evacuate to resettlement centers within 48 hours on a mandatory basis. In addition, Congress passed Public Law 503, which made it a misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year in prison and a $5,000 fine to violate Executive Order 9066. Therefore, Japanese Americans in the West Coast were all forced to move to remote and inhospitable internment camps because they were considered a public danger. More than 70,000 people of Japanese descent who were considered United States citizens lived in tar-papered barracks with communal mess halls and latrines and conducted very limited social activities. They lived in these conditions for 3 years or more until the end of World War II. The social and cultural patterns of Japanese Americans were also thus interrupted. These Japanese Americans lost their rights as citizens and had no means of support to uphold their loss of property and personal freedom. However, there were indeed citizens who challenged the constitutionality of the forced relocation through legal action. Instead of obeying the order to relocate, a Japanese American living in San Leandro, Fred Korematsu, chose to remain in his residence and was sentenced to 5 years in prison for violating Executive Order 9066. The American Civil Liberties Unions represented him in a lawsuit against the government while he was in prison, challenging the constitutionality of the government's actions. However, no miracle happened. In 1944, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the detention was a matter of military necessity and not based on race. They argued that as a result of the Pearl Harbor attacks, all people of Japanese descent were considered a threatening presence to U.S. territory and national security, and therefore the military's order was not unreasonable but rather motivated by a greater good of the nation. This case reaffirms the right given to the United States to deprive American citizens of Japanese descent of their properties and personal liberty. In addition to this, Japanese Americans like Gordon Hiyabayashi and Mitoe Endo also challenged the authority of the governments at the time. However, skeptics also started to emerge. Justice Murphy of the Supreme Court said in the case of Mitoe Endo, "I join in the opinion of the court, but I am of the view that detention in relocation centers of persons of Japanese ancestry, regardless of loyalty, is not only unauthorized by the Congress or the executive, but is another example of the unconstitutional resort to racism inherent in the entire evacuation program. As stated more fully in my dissenting opinion in Fred Korematsu versus United States, racial discrimination of this nature bears no reasonable relation to military necessity and is utterly foreign to the idea and traditions of the American people." Back to us now, we cannot examine the past from the present. It is understandable that the American casualties as well as the military losses due to the Pearl Harbor attack led to an extreme reaction. But there is no denying that Japanese Americans were innocent. The denial of civil rights and personal liberties was given the good name of protecting the nation at the time. Even more ironic was that one detainee was told that they had been placed in the camps because the state also wanted to protect Japanese Americans from the strong anti-Japanese sentiment in the state. He retorted, "If we were put there for our protection, why were the guns at the guard towers pointed inward instead of outward?" The Pearl Harbor attack created the most profound anti-Japanese sentiment in the U.S. history, setting off one of the first waves of early U.S. injustice against foreign immigrants. Although President Ronald Reagan acknowledged the wrongdoing and made amends in 1988, the attack significantly affected the lives of Japanese Americans and American public's perception of foreign races. More importantly, it changed Japanese Americans' lives, set off the debate and thinking about racial discrimination in the United States, and was a major turning point in the history of the United States and the world with regard to racial issues.